All right. Hey. Let's start right off with meditation. Let yourselves be comfortable. Let yourselves be on the front of your sits bones so your back is as upright as works for you. And let your breath reach through your whole body. Feeling the whole skin surface of your body breathe. There's several ways to sense the body. Breathing, sensing the breath, pranayama, that's one. Scanning the body is another. Letting attention freely float in the body is a third. Focusing on the belly center is a fourth. But for now, just let your breath reach into your lower body. It gives the mind something to do. And it also encourages the feeling of the body, the sensing of the body. And notice that as your body settles, it settles to a set point, kind of how a thermostat has a set point. Your nervous system goes to a familiar place, more or less relaxed. And just notice what that set place is for you. What's that set place like physically? What's that set place like emotionally? What's that set place like mentally? Is the mind moving? Is the mind not moving? Is the heart content or anxious or angry or uh, full of joy? Is the body light? Is it heavy? Is it loose? Is it tight? Probably a mixture of a lot of things. But let yourself really notice what that set point is. Ideally, without any judgment. So you're just noticing objectively. And it's very important to notice that set point of your nervous system without judgment, if possible, without critique, without even positive judgment. You're just noticing the shape of your mind, the state of your heart, the state of your body, where your nervous system goes to when you're still. That's the place where meditation goes to work, so to speak, where it really starts. If you can really sit with your state, sort of default state, and there'll be consciousness in the body because you're meditating, and that'll have an impact on the physical state. It'll tend to move in an optimizing direction. The body will tend to relax where it needs to relax. It'll tend to firm up where it needs to firm up. If the cortisol level needs to go down, it'll go down. If it needs to go up, it'll go up. The neurotransmitters, the electrical impulses, consciousness will optimize the physiology, the structure. And it'll do the same thing with the emotions. If the emotions are wound up, it'll tend to calm them. The emotions are depressed, it'll tend to bring more elevating qualities. Emotion. Maybe more pleasure or more joy. If there's a kind of fuzzy state emotionally, ambiguity or fuzzy or something like that, it'll tend to bring more of a peace, a simplicity. Whatever's running around unconsciously in the body or in the heart will harmonize, will naturally correct. But only if you're really still with the experience, if you really sort of stay with it and don't try to fix it and don't judge it, and really open with your cells, with your nerve endings, really open with your heart. That's what consciousness is, direct experiencing. And then it'll do the same thing with the mind. In our minds, all kinds of crazy stuff goes on. But if we just notice the state of the mind, the shape of the mind, and we don't engage the content, the stories will lighten, The interpretations will lighten, they'll be seen through. That they're just interpretations, some healthier, some less healthy, but even the healthy ones are just perspectives, just ideas. So consciousness will also optimize the head center or the mind. And it'll do the same thing for the sexual center. If we're too sort of hyped up sexually, maybe in a painful lust state, it will tend to calm that, or the vital center is not being experienced and sort of depleted just from lack of conscious contact, it'll tend to activate it. So the set point of the nervous system, whether it's the sex center or the body center or the heart or the mind, it'll get reset in meditation. We really stay right where we are in all our parts. You'll notice a resetting, a movement. The thermostat level will get reset. Without you having to reset it. So meditation is a great act of trust, a great act of surrender. It's sort of an experiment on, well, is there grace or not? Or what is the underlying life effect if I'm not controlling it? Or where do I naturally move to if I'm awake and I don't move myself? And even, who am I? What am I? Even that is revealed. Okay, and then just take your time to let your eyes open. You know, it's kind of cool that meditation does all that on its own. It's very counterintuitive. You know, often we feel like we have to do something. And the ego structure, the sort of image of ourself, the thought self, the representational self, the psychological self that develops in childhood and maintains through most of life, tends to be afraid of being still, tends to not want to be still, because the very act of meditation unwinds that structure, dissolves that structure. You might have noticed sometimes before you sit to meditate, you don't necessarily want to do it. You know, I meditate most mornings, and often, you know, I wake up and I know, okay, I'm about to meditate and I don't want to do it. You know, I usually do it though. And having a psychological self is not a bad thing. It's a necessary stage. Um, and, few people reach real maturity as human beings and sort of go beyond that psychological self. But it is part of your birthright and your birth possibility. If your psychological self falls off, you don't stop. You're still there, your presence is still there, your body is still there, your mind is still there, your heart is still there. You still know not to cross the street on the red light, and um, you have all the information available to you that you need to live, and a certain objectivity about things, a neutralness, a clearness about things, as opposed to the psychological self and beliefs throwing you in certain directions, sort of thrusting us as human beings to think this or feel that or be this way or not that way, or all these things. And there's nowhere that it does that more than in relationship. And in relationship, there's nowhere that it does that more than in sex. Sex is like a heavily charged subject matter for the psychological self. So, make sure you have a pad and pen, and you may want to jot some things down. We'll do some writing soon, but you may start to have insights as we're doing the class together as to, what are those psychological beliefs? What are those psychological issues? What is your psychological conditioning around sex? I'll go over a few general ones, but the more interesting ones, or even with the general ones, it's more interesting if you notice, for you particularly, what's the Oedipal issue like? Everybody has Oedipal issues. Oedipal issues are, uh, when we're children, we notice that we're opposite sex with the opposite sex parent, and there's some sense of polarity there. It's usually not a full-blown kind of genital sexual kind of feeling, but it is sexual in the sense of polarity and difference, and because we're different than them, and it's polarized like magnets. There's a type of being drawn to them as somebody of the opposite gender. And then there's a feeling typically of shame and wrongness about that. And that's basically what the Oedipal situation is. And then that tends to make us feel sort of, wrong about sex. Like we need to keep it under control, and uh, can't feel that, better shut off that sexual center. That's taboo. Parents are often really freaked out about that. They notice, that there's this polarized relationship with their child, the opposite sex child, sometimes the same sex child. And instead of realizing, oh, that's natural, and just to have just the lightest amount of a positive playfulness around that, they typically get very scared about that, and really lock it down, and don't let that playfulness be there. Shrish, is there any chance your camera's zooming in and out? Awesome, thanks. um, that's what mostly happens, is it all just gets repressed and locked up and tightened up, and then that's not great for the vital center, for the sexual self. And then sometimes it goes in the opposite direction, and the parent is exploitive of that. The child is innocent, and the parent somehow exploits the child sexually. That's much more rare, but much more traumatic. And then sometimes it's just right. Alicia's dad really got that. That's one of the things I loved about Alicia. She was just very in contact with her sexuality, and her and her dad had just the right amount of that like playful polarity without it being too much and thinking like, God, this is weird, and without it being like stiff and denied, and you know, to repressed. So, you can jot down what speaks to you about that or how that went, or, if that resonates for you, or, maybe it went just right for you, or maybe it didn't and you resolved it, or maybe you didn't even know that those are very common uh, psychological issues for people. In fact, um, it's the central part of Freud's body of work. That's the central part, actually. I'm not saying it's the most important part of psychology, but it was, for him, it was the central issue. And then, of course, there are cultural issues. Nowadays people are paying a lot more attention to the fact that culture plays a big part. You know, what kind of culture did you grow up in? What were the viewpoints in your culture? Your societal culture, your family culture, your friend culture. Um, what beliefs did you take on? And you needed to take them on because otherwise you couldn't operate in that culture. The repercussions for people who violate cultural sexual taboos are extreme. In some parts of the world, they dismember people, for violations of sexual cultural rules. But even if it's not that extreme, it usually involves a lot of shame. I grew up in Greenwich Village. Manhattan was the sort of gay center of the world. But when I went to junior high school and high school, there was all kinds of prejudice and bigotry against people who were gay, even in the gay capital of the world, Manhattan. My school wasn't very far from Greenwich Village. My junior high school was right outside of it. So, there's all kinds of cultural psychology, that we take on in different cultures. Here we are in the United States, but maybe you're from another culture. Your parents came over here, like me. I was originally French, so I got some dose of the French culture around it, and then the American culture. So there's too many different variations of that for me to go into all the psychological orientations of the different culture, but you can look for yourself and then see how that plays out, including the fact that nowadays we're in a very polarized cultural psychology around sex and gender. We've got on the one side the right, people very stiff, very rigid about sexual norms and what should be and what shouldn't be, and then we got and they're crazy in their way, and then we got people on the left who seem to be just as crazy and just as sort of opinionated and stiff about how it should be, but it's like the exact opposite. So there's all kinds of cultural stuff going on nowadays. Strange cultural psychologies where people can't really just explore their own sexuality and see what they like and what they find. And, um, people saying there is no gender and it has to be like this and everybody's the same and da 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 on one side and on the other side, no, there is and it has to be like this. And, you know, as opposed to what I'm trying to support tonight is inquiry into sexuality, so that you're not biased and thrown by your family psychology, your cultural psychology, Oedipal issues, human, inevitable uh, psychological twists and turns. So you start to get some freedom from all of that. Those forces are very, very strong. And it applies not just to um, sexuality in a relationship, it also applies to your own sense of sexuality. You know, even if you're not in a relationship or in a relationship and not being sexual with the person, you're still a sexual being. So it impacts your sense of gender, it impacts your sense of sexuality, it impacts how you experience your sexual organs, which is also your vital center, it impacts your vitality. Now, another sort of group of issues that I want to touch on is uh, body issues. Body issues are very impactful in our psychology. There's all kinds of stuff about men should have big penises, or but not too big, or this or that, or women should have big breasts or small breasts, or be this color or that color, or um, this weight or that weight, or this age, or but not that age. And when we do the resolution program and the sensuality or the resolution process in the sensuality expansion program, how we start all of our uh, extended orgasm intensives in the sensuality expansion program, we start with the resolution where we have people look at what their inner critic is attacking them about. And usually one of the biggest things is body image, their bodies. Um, and it's usually a little bit, we have to kind of dig for it a little bit because it's something that, we don't talk about much. And when our inner critic or our psychology is on our back about we should look this way or have this kind of body or whatever, be this age or that age, um, that has a dramatic effect on our willingness to be naked in front of somebody or willingness to enjoy our own bodies ourselves, much less our willingness to be sexual. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is wrong, right? I am saying it's limiting, that it's very strong underlying uh, uh, psychological directives, that it's very intense, it's very impactful, but I'm not saying that it's wrong. We do need to go through this to survive our cultures and to grow up, and that life manages to develop us, and it's a miracle that all this psychology exists, but it is a stage. And ultimately, it's limiting, even though it helps us grow and survive, and it's necessary as a stage. Ultimately, it's limiting, and none of it is true. So, you can begin to contemplate, if you like, what would it be like to be totally free of all body issues and all Oedipal issues and all psychological issues, and really experience the miracle that you are, not just as a human being and a spiritual being and all of that, but as a sexual being, real sexual freedom. So we're not criticizing the stage of developing a psychological self and all the psychological sexual data, stable data, uh, directives, and so on. But we want to, distinguish it for ourselves. What are the particulars for you? Because once you are willing to know that and you saturate that with consciousness through inquiry, which we'll do today, through meditation, which we already did today, consciousness has that optimizing effect. Anything that's not true, it'll just erase. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your body. There's nothing wrong with your gender. As far as I can tell, there's nothing wrong with anything. So it'll just erase all of that. But it does need consciousness. It does need to come into consciousness for consciousness to do its uh, optimizing optimizing work. Now, there is a sort of interim resolution. You can resolve the issues the way I'm talking about. There is a kind of interim resolution, which is an erotic approach. And a lot of people take this erotic approach, which is they take their psychological self and then to get around the feelings of shame and wrongness, maybe they take on a masochistic or a sub personality in sex. Or maybe there's a lot of aggressive psychological content, so they take on a dom role or even a sadistic type of role. Um, or there's a lot of insecurity, so they dress up as a police woman or a policeman or something like that. So people do all kinds of erotic twists and turns to um, make it so that they can have sex, and then they're still kind of including all that psychological material. And that's not bad. It's not a bad thing to do. It is an interim solution. But the problem is, as you may have heard me say before, if you lean on that erotic, that kind of mental turn on all the roles and equipment and um, uh, sort of viewpoints, storylines, and so on, uh, it 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 becomes addictive, and you get less and less return on the actual sexual experience. You need to be more and more submissive or more and more dominant or more and more equipment and that kind of thing. I remember once Alicia and I went to a sex party, and uh, we were having an extended orgasm date, and almost everybody around us was like whipping and spanking and all this kind of stuff, and it was fine. We were fine with it, no problem with it, but people for the most part weren't getting off. And then I remember at some point a couple of the women were like noticing and like pointing to their boyfriend like, oh, look at that, oh, because Alicia was really getting off, as you've seen her do in demonstration of extended orgasm. And my apology if I'm not meaning to sort of bolster her or us here. I'm just saying that to sort of demonstrate that you don't want to get too caught up in that, because it just leads to sex not going so well. You want it to be a little sprinkle that you add on, and keep your primary approach to sex sensual, like the actual experience of the turn on and the tumescence and the excitement and the contact and the intimacy and like that. Um, this is not exactly, I mean, this is not exactly really psychological content, but um, another issue that comes up for people around sex is simply ignorance. There's a wealth of information about the male anatomy and the female anatomy and orgasm and sexual positions and tantra and energetic states and fields of energy and lines of energy. I mean, it's just, we've been exploring this for me about 30 years, Alicia about 20, and we're finding more and more and more, but as human beings, we're often not trained in that. So another issue is people just kind of not knowing their way around the body map or the subtle body map or orgasm or, like that. So it's not exactly a psychological issue, but the resolution to that is learning and practice. Right? That's one of the 4 practices we recommend everybody do daily is sensual practice. Fine to do it alone. It can be alone, can be with a partner. It doesn't even need to really be sexual. It could be walking around, you know, uh, in a park and kind of feeling the vibe between people that you pass and noticing how your body responds. It could be meditating and focusing on your sexual center. Could be the touching practices. Could be stroking extended orgasm practice. Could be mutual stimulation positions and exercises. You could obviously mix them all up. So the resolution to the typical ignorance that we have as human beings around this is learning and practice. Right? And there's no, because it's an embodied act and a real part of ourselves, it's not enough to just have the learning. Like the insights and understanding won't do it. It actually has to be practiced. The way if you want to learn about basketball, you need to learn basketball, the rules of basketball, all this stuff. But then, you actually have to dribble the ball and play games and, like that. All right, so I think I'll just say one more thing because I want to get you all into an exercise, and that is um, if we manage to kind of clear out the psychological issues permanently, temporarily, however it goes, we notice that this desire, this longing that can be expressed sexually through the sexual center, emotionally through the heart, physically, mentally, this kind of interest and longing that we have as human beings, almost like we're looking for something, right? Typically, what we think we're looking for is, a better car or a better house or a better partner or some problem to resolve or, I don't know what, more money or more sex or whatever. But if we really go to the root of that longing and desire, including sexually, we find that it's a desire for awakening, a desire for union. In some traditions, it's called the beloved. And romantic longing, kind of a passionate longing, is another way that that's expressed. Like, so it's a very interesting way to look at sex. Okay, yes, it's about feeling good in the body, and that's awesome. I certainly love it, and orgasm and all of that. But it's even got a deeper level to it, right? Like that, it's a movement towards life, like how life creates more life, how beings create more beings. That it has a kind of a drive to union, a drive to awakening. So it's very interesting to find that at the, underneath sexual drive. So it's not exactly a psychological issue, but it's something that starts to surface as the psychological um, issues start to resolve. So I want to put you all into groups, not groups, but pairs for a repeating question.